it may not be reality, and the government has come out to say, oh, that the Transparency International did not take into full account what's going. I did also read, was it on Sahara? I don't know how true is that the federal government was blaming Obieze Kwesili and Obasanjo, that they are part of the Transparency International, so they expect that kind of report. But where my mind also went to is that the ease of doing business report came out, that Nigeria moved up 24 places from 169 to 145, and the federal government was quick to take on that, you know. So why are you not quick in taking on this? You know, but what's your own assessment?
Well, I mean, thanks for having me. Obviously, it's a topical issue that people have been talking about since it was released. But I guess the way to look at it would be to say, how have we performed on the Transparency International CPI over the last few years? In the last decade, the worst performance was right about 2012.
Yes.
2012, I think our ranking then was like 144. And then it dropped to like 136.
36, yeah.
And stayed there throughout the rest of Jonathan's administration, into this administration, and then, you know, spiked again to like 148. Before we look at, you know, the details of how that, what could have led to it, it'd be good to understand how Transparency International calculates the index. So it's not like two people sit in a room and decide what country it should be.
Put.
They conduct about 13 global assessments around the world. They talk to about 13 different institutions, including the World Bank, African Development Bank, World Economic Forum, you know, such big credible organizations. So to trivialize the ranking by saying it's Obieze Kwesili and Obasanjo, who, yes, indeed, have some affiliation with Transparency International, would be playing ostrich. It would be burying our heads in the sand and refusing to do an assessment of what could have led us there. By the way, Nigeria is not the only country in Africa that dropped in the ranking. Ghana took a terrible beating, you know, although we all like the current president. Yeah, some of the high-ranking countries on the scale also dropped. Norway, Finland, and so on. You know, so let's not politicize it. Let's instead look at what could have led to this. In my assessment, I think that in the 2 years of the Buhari administration, things could have remained steady in terms of perception, because, you know, the people who do these surveys were expecting to see what the government is about, with all the talk
aggressive
around
drive,
you know, anti-corruption. But 2.5 years in, or maybe about 2 years in, and there's no big name that's been prosecuted and driven from, you know, accusation to penalty. There's not been a lot of transparency to what the anti-corruption crusade is about. We hear that they recover monies. We don't know how much is recovered. We don't know from whom. We don't know whether it's recovered or not. So these are the things that drive the perception. And for people who claim it's perception and not a measure of corruption, yes, you're right. Corruption is not an easy thing to measure. So you have to measure the perception. If corruption was easy to measure, we won't have it. You know, we will solve the corruption. Yeah. So the best measure we have today that is globally accepted is the CPI. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have its limitations, you know, and some big name scholars have criticized it. One, that it measures just perception. Two, because of its nature as perception, perception is stickier. So if you have a perception of me as a bad person, I have to do double time to convince you otherwise. So perception sticks longer than if we were able to measure corruption in absolute terms. But it's difficult to measure corruption in absolute terms. The third criticism is that it measures public sector corruption and not private sector corruption. So all of the Enron scandal, you know, Halliburton and so on will not show up in the index. You know, so some of the countries where these things happen will continue to score high, but they also have their own corruption in the private sector.
You've raised quite a whole lot of issues, but I think let's take it from this angle of recovered monies, because we did put together something, especially for our viewers, for talking about what EFCC has recovered. And the figures that we have, if we can put that on the screen, guys, EFCC says, according to the acting chairman of EFCC. EFCC says that about 738.9 billion naira was recovered from May 2015 to October 20, 2017. And so far, as at October last year, about 30 billion naira has been recovered through the whistleblower policy. Yes. That's what we have. Then 2,150 tips received by the Ministry of Finance as at October last year through the whistleblower policy. The EFCC chairman says that 473 billion naira has been released, has been recovered by the EFCC in 2017. So that earlier figure that I gave you, that's it on the screen. That earlier figure that I gave you, 738 was released. That 738 billion was recovered. What am I saying? Released, recovered from May 2015 to October 2017. Of course, we do know what happened in Lagos some time ago, Victoria Island, Legico Plaza, 449 million. Those are the numbers on the screen for you to digest. Now, you said earlier on that we really do not know how much has been recovered, but like what I've told you right now, according to the FCC, this is what they've told us has been recovered. What do you have to say about that? And from whom?
You see, that's the problem. Yeah? If you must come to equity, you must come with clean hands. Transparency is the most important thing here. You know, if EFCC is doing so well, then tell us, open up your books, tell us who you recovered it from, tell us the circumstances under which the person or persons made the money, so that we can even go back and plug those gaps, right? So it's not just about recovering money, it's ensuring that we prevent the corruption, right? But if you don't give us the names of the people, if you don't share the process for recovering it, if you don't share which accounts those monies have been paid into, then we also run a risk that the recovered loot could be looted again.
Yeah.
You know, so these are all the issues that tend to affect a perception of corruption in Nigeria. Again, it's a perception. And so when people are polled, or when these institutions are polled, you know, they look at, do you have confidence in the numbers that EFCC is releasing?
That's another issue.
That's a question.
Yeah, because it's also been said that how corrupt-free is EFCC also? Yes, that's another question.
Or have we built an anti-corruption industry where people are making money from the fight of corruption? You see where I'm going? So unless there's transparency, and that's why, you know, some of the things we do in Nigeria sometimes seems to be a bit half-baked, not well thought through. And that's why, you know, some of us believe that the process EFCC is going through will not lead to an end of corruption, because we're not focusing on the root causes.
And what are the root causes?
We're focusing on the symptoms of it. Now, if we go to social science evidence, you know, wherever corruption is when you use access to public power for private benefits.
Gains, yeah.
Yeah. So for as long as there are situations where an individual or group of individuals have discretion over grant of access or grant of some type of benefit that has value, therein lies an opportunity for corruption. So for as long as, and I know it's going to sound a bit too academic, but that's the heart of it. For as long as we have continued influence and involvement of government in the things it shouldn't be involved in, then that's the route for corruption. Now, how do you solve this? One is you must reduce the size of states. You know, so government must exit the things it shouldn't be involved in. Number two, you must limit the human interface in the fight for corruption. Let me give you an example. If I'm assessed for taxes and, you know, you realize that I haven't paid my taxes, for instance, and you send a tax officer to me, that interface with the tax officer creates an opportunity for corruption. Because now I can look at, okay, I owe the government X amount of money. If I can get this guy to take a fraction of that X, I'm still way ahead. So that creates, so for us to fundamentally solve corruption, we must remove or limit these points of human interface.
So what do you use as a substitute there? If you don't send a tax officer after me?
How have they done it in other parts of the world? How do they collect taxes in other parts of the world? It's all linked, technology links up. Yes, links up everything. You know, you must triangulate information. You know, so Some of that effort has started in the previous administration and continued in this administration with the BVNs, with what we're trying to do with the national ID card, with linking up, trying to create different touch points where you leave your fingerprint, and by the time you link up everything, who, for instance, has made money or not made money, and you can tie things back. But for as long as we have those points of human interface, it's difficult to solve corruption. Number two is, a lot of what we see happening in EFCC is the bluster of, we are doing something. I don't see the diligence that goes with building a case first before we jump out there. And that's why it's difficult for us to really prosecute anyone and catch anyone.
I think EFCC says it's gotten about 180 convictions. I think the last report that I read.
Wouldn't it be fabulous if we opened the newspapers tomorrow and we saw the names of all these convictions? Put the person's name, put his picture, or her. Wouldn't it be fabulous? Why are we living in the 21st century and behaving as if we're living in the 18th century, where we have to go to some Blackstone and somebody will rub it and tell us that he's heard from the gods? If you have convicted people, put their names out there. Let's see who they are. Give us the instance, the circumstance under which the corruption was committed, and tell us what we are doing to plug it and make sure it's not happening again. But for as long as we don't see that information, we'll continue to doubt whether this thing is really happening or not.
Now, Patrick, I want to ask you this question. Do you think that, are you of the perception side or are you of the reality stance? Let me
phrase it again, so I'm sure I'm answering the right question.
Okay. People say that, it's just perception. Other people say it's reality. There's corruption everywhere. Are you of the perception stance or of the reality stance?
Let me answer the question with an example, right? So there are states in Nigeria where the commissioners of the states, their monthly salary is 500,000 naira. How can a commissioner survive on 500,000 naira? There are civil servants, senior civil servants, whose salary is 120,000, 130,000 naira. But you look at their lifestyle, and it tells you that they're living way, way, way beyond their means. Do we need a soothsayer to tell us that these people are surviving on the proceeds of corruption? There's nobody in Nigeria who needs to talk about the perception of corruption in Nigeria. We know it. That is why we are where we are.
So you're of the reality stance. That is real.
And I'm telling you that there is nobody in Nigeria who, unless the person is sick in the head, who thinks that corruption in Nigeria is a perception. Corruption is alive and well, and has been alive and well for a long time. It did not start with the Buhari administration. Let's get that clear. It did not even start with democracy. It did not start with independence. Corruption has been in Nigeria. The problem is that we've gotten to a tipping point where it's now galloping. Before, okay, so I read something in the news. The civil defense in their budget has like 250 million or 256 million naira that they want to buy some nuclear weapon detecting.
When I saw that, I didn't understand that story.
Okay, so for me, that is the blatancy that I'm talking about. That I am not even going to try to pretend anymore. That's the blatancy I'm talking about. That before we've had corruption, you make some effort, you take 10%, you tell us some nice story to take another one. We have gotten to a point where, who cares? Because nothing happens. In Nigeria, the problem is when you do corruption and do small corruption, such that when they come after you, the money you have stolen is not enough for you to buy your freedom. But when you steal big money, then you join the boys, and then we sit down and talk about how to do this thing. That's the problem. So there's no question of whether there is perception of, we are swimming in corruption. There are people who go to work every day, and it is obvious that the salaries that are being paid should not be able to bring them to work. So until we go back and begin to address those fundamental issues, we have created a system where only through corruption can you survive. That's the point. That's the fundamental point. That when you employ a senior civil servant, and after 20 years in the service, they're still earning 150,
And you know clearly that 150 cannot even take them home.
Cannot pay their transport salary,
yes.
their transport costs
allowance, yes.
to come to work and go home. So the fact that they still come to work and go home means that they understand that the way to survive in this system is to create your own toll gate. And that is why if you have anything to do with government, you go through toll gates. And at every toll gate, you drop something. At every toll gate, you drop something. That is how you institutionalize corruption.
Now, if we take a look at that index by Transparency International, because I took time to read, especially for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and we saw that countries like Botswana, Rwanda, Seychelles, Mauritius came up, Namibia came up in that index. But some other countries did not do well. Liberia, for example. And they said something, Transparency International said something, that most of the African countries that did not do well have leadership, have leaders that came into office to say we are going to fight corruption on anti-corruption ticket, yet they did not do well. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former president of Liberia, even in her speech did say when she was leaving that, oh, she was supposed to fight corruption, but she couldn't do that. And a lot of people have said, especially in Liberia, that nepotism, impunity, illegal contracts, and all of that plagued her administration. What do you think for African countries such as Nigeria coming back home? President Buhari, campaigned on that ticket, 3 pillars: I'll fight corruption, economy, and what's the other one? Security. And yet, in his administration, Nigeria fell woefully to 148. What does it say?
Well, I mean, if you also go back in time, there's some papers, academic papers, on how African countries where you had revolutionary leaders become president, how corruption then tended to thrive more in those countries. But I don't think there's a correlation. I don't think causation. I don't think there's a correlation here that once you pledge to fight corruption, then corruption is bad or worse in your country.
What about the phrase of corruption fights back?
No, I mean, it fights back everywhere. Corruption is fighting in the United States now, as we speak. The incumbent president, is fighting for his life. That there are allegations of corrupt practices during the elections with Russia and so on. But look at how they're doing that fight. Hardly is the prosecutor on TV telling you what he's going to do. They are building their case. You build your case and then you go after the people. Now, if President Buhari, when he made the pledge of fighting anti-corruption, took the time to sit down and say, okay, here is the big problem we're going to fight. How do we attack this problem? How do we engage this problem? Do we have the right people, qualified people in the force to be able to do it? Do we have the right technology, etc.? Maybe if that analysis yielded we don't have the right people or skills or resources to fight it, maybe you go about it another way. Which other way could you have gone about it? When the United States tried to jail Al Capone, who was a mob boss, and they couldn't find anything on him, how did they get him in jail? Tax evasion. And once they had him in jail for tax evasion, they threw on contempt of court and a few other things. But every American, the whole world knows that Al Capone went to jail because of his mob activities, right? So if you looked at Nigeria and saw that you didn't have enough evidence, enough skills, enough resources to fight corruption through the courts, maybe we could have tried something different. So couldn't we have, caught some people on tax evasion or something related, where that you're still jailing them using the rule of law, but everybody knows that you're following that tact because you don't have everything you need to fight corruption the way you should fight it. Yeah, just jumping out there and shouting that we're fighting corruption cannot do it. You need a little bit more intelligence. You need a little bit more technology, information, etc., to be able to find and enabling laws. Now, but the bigger issue is when the anti-corruption fight appears to be a tool for witch hunting or for fighting the opposition, then you lose the support of the people. This is not the first time it's happening. It happened under Obasanjo, when you had Nuhu Ribadu.
People come, handcuff people.
Correct.
And they send one kind of psych into Nigerians at that time.
So people, and also the people who were being arrested by Nuhu Ribadu were seen as Obasanjo's political enemies. Nobody's saying they were not corrupt, but that picking and choosing, makes rubbish of the system. So I think there's need to go back to the drawing board. I think the challenges the current EFCC leadership is having with the National Assembly, it needs to be resolved. Concessions, compromises need to be reached. There needs to be a good, intelligent effort around how to catch people. We need to see some big fish. We need to see some big people go down. And not a situation where big names in the administration, when there are allegations against them on corruption, nothing happens. But if there's allegation against a minister from the former administration, everybody's out there, jumping around. It sends the wrong signal. Let's decide we want to fight corruption. Let's go after it, and let's just deal with it.
What do you think is the role of political leadership? Because even as the Transparency International released its reports, it acknowledged in the African section, it acknowledged that, the AU is trying to win the war against corruption now in Africa. And we had this kind of report. So what do you think is the role of political leadership? Because at the AU summit, President Buhari was called upon. He made his speech. What do you think is the role of political leadership? I
wouldn't even go as far as the AU. I'll focus on Nigeria and say that this is a Nigerian problem. It's an existential problem. If we don't solve the corruption problem, we can't go anywhere because it's eating deep into our marrow. Yeah, it's like a cancer that's deep. And in fact, it's beginning to look like to kill that cancer, you have to kill the person. That's what it's beginning to look like. That leadership has to come from Nigeria. Let's forget about the AU. AU has its own problems. This is a Nigeria problem. If there is the fear with which Nigerians welcomed a Buhari president has been frittered away. By 2015, what Nigerians remembered was the Buhari of '83. Whose word was law, etc.
Perhaps that was why most Nigerians voted for him.
Of course. Those who voted for him believed that he was going to bring that sternness, that singleness of purpose. And that was why when he said, I'm going to focus on corruption and did not talk about a few other things, people said, okay, if the only thing you deliver for us, that's good. We can now restart the economy, etc. later. Even when the economy went in recession, everybody gave him, some slack to say, if you keep fighting the corruption, we can come back to the economy. So the buck stops on one table and one table only. President Buhari must step forward and show that force, that presence, that character that Nigerians sought in 2015. It must be clear that there are no favorites. It must be clear. So if somebody in his administration there's a whiff of corruption around the person, you immediately tell them to step aside, and then you get an independent body to investigate, and if they're found guilty, you bring down the full weight of the law on them.
Do you think that President Buhari got it at the beginning of his administration? Or it was at the beginning of the administration too that his steps were faltered?
I think I've said it probably here or in some other forum that, he wasted a lot of time. He wasted a lot of time, and it demystified him. It showed Nigerians and the world that he wasn't quite prepared. It made it seem as if he didn't think he was going to win, and then they won, and then they're scrambling to figure out what to do. But that's water under the bridge. We are where we are, yeah. And today is still money. He can still do a lot, if he decides to step up today. If the Magu Senate confirmation thing is becoming a problem, sometimes you have to step back one step to achieve, a bigger goal. Number two, he needs to step forward. Nigerians need to see Muhammadu Buhari. Right now, we appreciate that, there's some health concerns and so on, and the prayers are going on for him to get better. But even in that, in this whole process, there needs to be the clarity that he is the man that was voted to bring this thing to a stop. Now, bringing it to a stop is not the force of, just go out and arrest. You need to build a case. You need to build a case. You need to look at the incentive system. How do you incentivize people to come up with the right evidence you need to, to prosecute? Now, the prosecution would not solve the corruption at the root level. Yeah. However, it will indicate, which is what we're looking for now, indicate that Nigeria has now finally said, you know what, enough is enough. We are going to solve this corruption problem and, and put an end to it.
It's so disturbing that Nigeria is the second worst country out of 17 countries in West Africa. So that means that Nigeria is a corrupt country, isn't it? Or should we not take that? Just like James Cameron, is it James Cameron or David Cameron?
David, yeah.
James Cameron is the director. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of the UK, said fantastically corrupt, and we all went berserk.
Did we? I mean,
and then our president was on his way, and he landed London for.
You see, I don't think there's anybody in Nigeria, who is still struggling with the fact that we're a corrupt country. Show me that person and I show you someone who just landed from Mars, right? There is no question. It's alive and well around us every day, everywhere. The point is, what are we going to do about it? By the way, Nigerians say that we don't want corruption. We probably need to interrogate that a bit further to find out if are we really saying that we don't want corruption? Or is what we're saying that I don't like it when I'm not the person benefiting from the corruption? Because if we really do not want corruption, there's the level of engagement, there's a level of anger that would be visible to the political leadership. And you can see that the political leadership responds when they think that they're losing the people. But today, you don't quite see that sense of outrage from Nigerians. Maybe it's because we've been beaten down into submission, and maybe it's because, everyone wakes up in the morning and struggling for the daily bread, yeah? So, but there needs to be that sense of, this can't work. For instance, I believe that if the APC government were to wake up tomorrow and realize that they're going to lose the 2019 election on the account of that they haven't been able to deliver on the anti-corruption thing, and that what will swing Nigerians on their side is to see 5, 6, 7, 10 big names in jail, I believe that before Friday you can get that result. But because today, it seems like, everybody is going on their merry way, nobody cares, whatever. So you don't really have to do anything about it. So that's the problem. One, we need to be sure that as a people, we really don't want corruption. And two, the political class needs to see that there is a consequence to them if we do not solve the corruption problem.
Now, let's take a look at some of the recommendations by Transparency International. And it says that government and businesses must do more to encourage free speech and an open and engaged civil society. 2, government should minimize regulations on media, including traditional and new media. 3, we knew what happened, was it 2 years ago, talking about social media ban and all of that. 3, civil society and government should promote laws that focus on access to information. 4, activists and governments should take advantage of the momentum generated by United Nations Sustainable SDGs to advocate and push for reforms at the national and global level. Then 5, government and businesses should proactively disclose relevant public interest information in open data formats. Take on some of these recommendations.
So what's the common thread that cuts across all of these recommendations?
Openness, transparency, freedom.
Yeah. So if you look at the kinds of corruptions, where the big corruptions happen, I think I might have alluded to it earlier on, is where a person or a group of persons have discretion over award of something. Yeah. We must limit those points where there is discretion. And how do you do that? It's to minimize the number of things that government is still involved in. Licensing, regulation, all of those types of things. The more of the active sectors of the economy we can move over to the private sector and really move over to the private sector, not some of the privatizations we've seen, where you really actually transition to the private sector, the less of the corruption. There's not going to be much corruption, public sector corruption, in the telecom space, except in like NCC, where there's still some licenses to be awarded. But the kind of corruption we used to see back in the day where NITEL could claim to buy X number of things and never bought it, you can never see again. Same thing in the power sector. You are not going to see a situation where the Minister of Power is claiming that he's, buying some big thing and the monies get missing, because we have also transitioned that. Now, there are also issues around, have we really transitioned, because government keeps trying to,
interfere.
Support. Yeah. So the common thread here is that you must limit the involvement of government in many of the active sectors of running the economy, you know, and all the other issues around, you know, freedom, respect for rule of law. I mean, all of us have enough examples of how, you know, certain laws have not been respected in Nigeria, certain judgments, etc. You know, so all of those issues we know. But for me, I think in the short time we have, the emphasis, I want to lay it more on limiting government involvement in the active, productive sectors of the economy. You know, when we do that, then, you know, the folks in government will have little or nothing that they're administering over.
Okay, just as we move to the end of the program, I know you've alluded to some solutions even while you were talking here. Are there other things you would want to talk about in terms of solutions? Because does it really make sense that this administration is trying to fight and say, oh no, trying to fight it and say no, 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 and all of that? What should we do?
We need to see some people face the music for their corrupt practices. The government must find a way to get to that. Now, I know that going through the court processes, you know, is a bit difficult.
Cumbersome.
But there are some other laws sitting on our books that you can. That's why I chose the Al Capone example. That when the U.S. government tried to get him on, you know, racketeering and all of that, and saw that he was really the Teflon Don, you know, nothing could stick, they went to tax evasion. But everybody knew that, you know, they got him because, you know, he was a mob boss. So there are people who we kind of suspect might be corrupt and so on. Maybe it's time to use, you know, other means to, but we need to see that the government is delivering on this. And this will not solve it at the root cause. At the root cause, we need to limit the areas where government has discretion over award, discretion over regulation, licensing, tax holidays, tax incentives. Those are massive cesspools, you know, of corruption beyond just the procurement one we see.
You know